Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much again for joining me. This is our last session together that we are in our series on Jews and Christian art, that we are really turning to the Jews' encounter with Christian art in early modern Italy. So in this final class together, we turn to real accusations against Jews that I have uncovered in northern Italy for the offense of image desecration. The total number of known judicial cases in which I have found from the beginning of the 14th century to the end of the 17th is around 71. But the more time I have to sit in archives, the more I will be able to find. And I believe that it is hardly surprising that Italy, out of all of Europe, should record such a large number of cases. This, of course, reflects the widespread presence of Jews throughout the peninsula in daily contact with Christians who frequently used these objects. In 13th and 14th century Italy, the mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans in their great churches, and here, of course, you see the friary in Venice, they were already using sacred images to educate illiterate people and remind them of sacred stories and mysteries. And these orders, these mendicant orders, supported their own image cults by housing images that had already shown their miraculous powers and taking charge of liturgical services dedicated to them. Crucifixes and images of the Virgin and Child, the Passion, and saints were displayed, of course, in confraternity chapels, in oratories, in cathedrals, in convents, in monasteries, friaries. This, again, you see the inside of the friary in Venice, and parish churches across northern Italy. Churches were lavishly furnished with fresco cycles, often commissioned by wealthy laypersons as manifestations of their hopes for salvation. And the liturgy used a vast array of objects, including sacred vestments, chalices, ciboria, candles, candle holders, bells, and of course, crosses. And remember, it was the 19th century Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt who argued that this materialism was a particularly Italian trait, since Italians had an eye for beauty and a genuine appreciation for the plastic arts, as they still do today. And the availability of affordable and diverse objects, furnishings, artworks, and religious texts grew, especially with the streaming of Byzantine artifacts into Italy, also after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. More than any other religion, I would argue, Catholicism was a religion of objects. And these objects were not just inside religious houses, because large portable statues, paintings, painted banners, diptychs, as you see here, and triptychs, rich in ornaments and artistic excellence, were brought out of the church to function as objects of contemplation, and the faithful during religious processions through the streets and the cities and through the streets of the cities and towns. And I think their presence created an environment in which street violence could be prevented and reverential behavior expected by anybody who passed before these images and statues, celebrating communal Christian piety, or communitas, as it was known in Latin, the sense of belonging that was so much part of early modern civic existence. Should Jews who were outside the Christian community fail to distance themselves from these processions, or show proper respect, at least by removing their hats, their behavior would be noticed and brought to the attention of Christian authorities. In the home, too, lay people treasured their sacred objects and used them regularly. Domestic objects included Madonna images, large crucifixes or passion paintings, rosaries, Agnus Deus, candles, candle holders, medals, holy water stoups, prints, and even small crucifixes to be worn as devotional jewelry or chains around people's necks. And as we shall see, Italian Jews encountered these objects, in particular images of Mary that were left behind or encased on walls in properties that they rented from Christians. Of course, too, the invention of the printing press and the distribution of paper as an inexpensive medium in the 1470s also modified practices of Christian devotion. Pictorial religious placards were hung in homes, churches, taverns, and town halls throughout the late medieval and Renaissance Europe, and used by the clergy to educate illiterate people who would not have been able to read the lives of saints or of the Madonna. And by the late 15th century, thousands of these devotional images had been made and were displayed in both public and private spaces. By the first decades of the 17th century, cheap devotional objects, such as single-sheet woodcuts, could be easily acquired from street sellers at markets, fairs, or the church steps to be distributed in great numbers in urban and rural neighborhoods and households. And this, what we're looking at, is actually one of these prints that I found on the back of an inquisitorial trial against a Jew who, having found somebody, obviously, presumably a Christian, hanging this outside his shop, had immediately told the inquisitor and asked the inquisitor to take it off himself so that the Jew would not be accused of desecrating it. And the wonderful thing is that it's still attached to the back of the trial document itself as almost proof that this was the actual print that was hanged upon the Jew's home. And this was really at the beginning of the 17th century. And as a result of the fragility of these objects were often the subject of desecration charges against Jews. So I suggest we do the following tonight. We will look at early modern judicial cases of image desecration before secular courts, and then turn to trials against Jews before the Italian Inquisition and analyze the types of testimonies that were given before the inquisitors. I'm then going to consider different types of accusations and how the Jews' disrespect towards Christian images becomes part of the accusation of desecration. And then I'm going to finally turn to images inside and also outside the Jewish homes so that you understand how this was also another part of that Jews had to navigate in living in very strong Catholic countries. So what do we see when we consider early modern judicial cases of image desecration before Italian secular courts? Well, I found so far 23 cases in which professing Jews were charged with image desecration and were known to have come before the courts in the 14th and 15th centuries. And this is everywhere, sort of in northern Italy, from Visio in the March to Livorno, and further north in the Modenese Duchy. In Italy, from around, I would say, the 1450s, Italian law courts had made image desecration a punishable offense. And this is not just for Jews. This is also for Catholics who, might show their frustration on a Christian image. They too could be accused of doing this. This is not exclusive just to Jews. And the number and spread of sacred images in cities and towns obviously increased, both inside but also outside private spaces. And they demanded a closer monitoring and policing to protect them. And where results of the cases were known, Most ended either without punishment of the Jew or with acquittal. Another thing that always interests me is what was the Christian object that the Jew had supposedly desecrated. And here we can see most of them are crosses or crucifixes, and then images of Mary, and we have 2 images of saints and 1 image of Christ. When I say image of Christ, I'm taking it not specifically a passion image. And it was the Christian images in the Jews' rented properties, situated on the outside wall, or in antechambers, in bedrooms, or in niches under the stairs, that would cause increasing Jewish anxiety through the 15th century. And at the root of this was the real fear for Jews that they would be accused of tampering with and desecrating them. Jewish tenants could never be at ease with these images, while Christians remained convinced that Jews would damage and destroy them. And I think it is this aspect of Jewish image desecration that brings to mind its contested nature. Actions taken by Jews to make their homes suit their traditions, of course, and taste. For example, whitewashing, completely painting white all over the image. That would be construed by Christians as an attack on Christianity. And here, more than other cases, I think reality and fantasy overlap. Since Jews are really actually, if they're getting rid of a picture on a wall, they're doing what Christians accuse them of. And of the 23 cases, 12, 52%, focused on images kept inside the homes, rented from Christians, and left behind by previous occupants. And these include not only trial proceedings against Jews for desecrating them, but also the Jews' official application for licenses to remove or temporarily cover them. And I'll talk more about licenses soon. In the 15th century, sacred images often found on the premises of well-to-do Jewish moneylenders was sometimes permanently obliterated, whitewashed over by the Jews themselves. And of course, Jews are going to prefer to whitewash and to permanently erase the image, so they had no visual reminder of the image in their homes. And this method was quickly rejected after they became aware how hard it was to secure licenses from both the ecclesiastical and later authorities to actually allow Jews to do this. And for me, the most fascinating case is that of Daniel Donosa, because he really whitewashed a Christian image on the facade of his house in Mantua. He permanently erased an image of the Madonna and Child, accompanied by saints, on the facade of his home. He had managed to get an episcopal license, that means from the church, but not a secular license to do so. So basically, probably what had happened was an episcopal, a priest or a cleric had gone with him to see this image, it thought that it wasn't valuable enough and thought it was okay to whitewash it. Possibly the Jew, Daniel Donosa, had paid him to, obviously, to get that license. And the situation was made worse since the erasure was on an outside wall, and so really could be seen by the neighbors, who were clearly sensitive to any suggestion of Jewish management of Christian images. And not only had Daniel failed to acquire a secular license, but he failed to state that he had no wish to offend Christianity, and had not offered a substitute painting, which he was clearly expected to do, because somehow that painting had to be recreated or exchanged for something else, and presumably something newer, something better as well. And on May the 27th, 1495, the outside of Daniel Donosa's home was attacked by Christians during a procession. paper prints of saints that accused Daniel of blasphemy were pasted on the outside of his home. And then the Christian aggressors began to shout and throw stones, only stopping as a result of the intervention of the captain of the guard. Daniel himself was absent from the city during this time, but when he returned, he appealed for protection to the Marquis Francesco Gonzaga. Francesco eventually decided that Daniel, as a penalty for whitewashing the image, would be hanged within 3 days unless he paid the large sum of 110 ducats for the construction of a more beautiful altarpiece to be dedicated to Our Lady of Victory in a local church. In addition, his home was to be destroyed and replaced by a church dedicated to Santa Maria della Vittoria. It was as if the consecration of a new house of worship would compensate for Daniel's whitewashing. A whitewashing of an image would be compensated for the building of a whole church. In 1499, the Jew had to pay for an additional painting, which also hung in the Santa Maria della Vittoria complex. And it was this carefully contrived painting, with its numerous, I think, iconographic messages, that for the first time included at the bottom of the painting the Jewish image desecrators, Daniel de Nossa, his son Isaac, and their wives, as miserable, guilt-ridden underlings. Above them, to the left, appears a small lion who looks disapprovingly down at the Jews. And the central image of the painting, of course, is an enthroned Madonna and Child, both of whom raise their right arm, as does Mary Magdalene to their right, as if to approve of the Jews' degradation. On the left side, you see a Saint Jerome holding a model of the new church in his hands to celebrate its consecration. Now, this incident was definitely a shock for the Jews of northern Italy, and they therefore began from this time to survey new premises they intended to rent, whether they were houses, synagogues, professional workspaces, or shops, and register the subject matter and the precise condition of any image with the local judicial authorities, and obviously both secular and religious authorities. Whitewashing was no longer a solution, but instead Jews requested permission to temporarily conceal the image which was in their home. A notary would then visit the Jew's home, record the exact condition of the image, which would then be covered, and the cover locked with a key, and the key handed over to the court or to the landlord of the property. And in theory, at least, this would save the Jew having to look at the image and from being accused of its desecration or destruction. And these new procedures were clearly effective in preventing them from getting further into trouble regarding images in domestic spaces. But the anxiety remained for the Jews, and that would continue after the reconstitution of the Papal Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition as it's also known, in the 1540s, another body that claims jurisdiction over Jews charged with image desecration. So now let's turn to the trials against Jews before the Inquisition and analyze the types of testimonies that were recorded. Of course, church courts were not supposed to have jurisdiction over unbaptized Jews, but in Italy, the Roman Inquisition tried to assert its claim to defend the church and the things that it held sacred against attacks from outsiders and misbelievers. And these were summarized in a papal bull known as Antiqua Iodorum Improbitas, the ancient wickedness of the Jews, which was a controversial bull written by Pope Gregory XIII in 1581. Inquisitorial records, and this is one of them that I've looked at, that I think they are particularly revealing on account of the dialogue between the judges, the witnesses, and the prisoners, which they often preserve, together, of course, with their denunciations and sentences. And what we see here is that our Jews are being disciplined, not for heresy, but for blasphemy or disrespect. And in fact, I always argue that inquisitorial records in Italy can be trusted more than in Spain and Portugal because the Jewish defendant is not actually facing a death sentence. It is obviously questionable whether inquisitorial sources can reveal what really happened, but inquisitorial rules and procedures demanded that denunciation be supported by eyewitness testimony, which meant that any accusation or evidence against the Jews was examined carefully. The Holy Office showed itself to be a court which focused on ascertaining the truth according to early modern standards, and this meant distinguishing between innocence and guilt, differentiating between degrees of guilt and punishing the Jews accordingly. And here you can see from a recent exhibition in the Inquisitorial building in Venice, some of the inquisitorial manuals that were used by inquisitors to really understand the different types of crimes and blasphemers, witches, and heretics that were brought before them. The cases I have studied show a shift in the nature of the charge brought against Jews, from fantastical to rational, and actually from desecration, as we've seen in our previous sessions, to disrespect regarding images both outside and inside the Jews' premises. I have found trials of the Inquisition in Modena, in Rome, in Livorno, in Siena, in Venice, and Pisa, and Ancona. But I believe, as I said before, that I think the number is far from exhaustive, and that there are probably more, and also ones that were lost when Napoleon walked through Italy from 1792 to 1801 and actually destroyed a lot of the archival material in Italy. Most of the cases of image desecration that I've seen were actually unresolved, meaning that they dropped the case and they didn't sentence the Jew for image desecration. There were 12 convictions in which a penalty was imposed on a prisoner or he received a reprimand. One of my sort of favorite objects of the Inquisition in Italy is this, which is known as the place where anybody could put in a denunciation against somebody else, and it was obviously a secret place, nobody knew about it. You put it in a piece of paper and you put it in the mouth, as you can see, of this figure. So of the 12 convictions that I've seen, 6 of the cases resulted in acquittals. And if we add the unresolved cases and the acquittals together, percentage makes 77%. And I think we need to understand that the Holy Office really drops a fair proportion of cases, either because they don't meet the standards of proof that we have by the 16th, 17th century, or because those who denounced the Jews were shown to have been inspired by personal malice and had no Christian witnesses who could support the accusation made against the Jews by the Christian denouncer. And at this point, the Inquisition would let the accused go and leave the case on file to be resumed if more evidence turned up at some future date. Obviously, the Inquisition could not impose upon Jews the spiritual penances which were so prominent a feature of the sentences it passed on Christian heretics. Half of the number of Jews convicted were given fines, and on 4 occasions, Jews were actually whipped in the local piazza. But these pecuniary punishments became almost a sort of a standardized form of punishment for the Italian Inquisition against Jews, which meant, of course, financial benefit as well for the court. Most of the Christian images were crucifixes or crosses. Some were carvings or paintings of the Madonna, often including the Christ child. Since between the 14th and the 17th century, they were frequently depicted together. Only one was a painting of a saint. And I think the fact that crucifixes, crosses, statues of Mary's, images of Mary's, passion paintings were the most common subject of attack is a reflection of the ubiquity of these images, as I said before, in Italy, at street corners, on walls, as well as in churches and public buildings, and even in work spaces. So let's sort of look a little bit deeper at some of these inquisitorial sources and what they have to tell us. If we look at the narrative of the inquisitors interrogating Jewish suspects, we can sense their belief that Jews were naturally prone to insulting or damaging images of Christ and the Virgin. And I wanted to give you an example of this. Obviously, these are all my translations from the original Latin and Italian of the inquisitorial trials themselves. And this is inquisitorial general Fra Michelangelo Leri, and he says to a Jewish suspect who's brought before him, his name is Simone de Camerino, and he's accused in 1614 of desecrating a Christian image. You are a Jew, he says, and by your very nature derive a hatred of Christians and their own rites and ceremonies. You see yourselves above our nation, our Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin, his mother, and consequently, it is likely that you uttered words to insult the image of the Blessed Virgin. It is unlikely that the deposition against you is not true. So what I'm really showing is that even though these inquisitors are supposed to be really interested in proof and evidence, there is still this sense that they're coming already with this idea that desecration is what Jews do. And our sources confirm the extent to which the Inquisition continued to propagate this narrative. If images were desecrated, the Inquisition expected Christians, of course, to denounce Jews for it. And it is interesting that between, I would say, around 1600 to 1670, charges of a different nature involving the Jews' disrespect for holy objects rather than violence or vandalism began to be made before the Papal Inquisition. I found 14 cases involving the Holy Sacrament and religious images that were escorted through the streets or passed under the windows of houses on the outside edges of the Jewish ghettos where the Jews were living at this time in Italy. Streets, of course, in Italian cities and towns were always enhanced with entry facades, with decorated doorways and large piazze that facilitated this flow of religious processions through their streets. And unlike the faithful who were to venerate the Eucharist and images by looking at them when they passed by and when they were displayed on temporary altars set along the streets and towns and cities, Jews were either to remove their hats out of respect, or they had to flee. They had to get away, run away as possible from what was approaching them, which was a religious procession. And Jews had first been prohibited from attending processions of the consecrated host as early as the Council of Vienna in 1267. Because then the festival of the Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, which was this Thanksgiving procession that you see shown here in this image, venerating Christ's body, the Eucharist, was now, from the 13th century, celebrated all over Europe. And any person present at this procession was expected to salute by removing their hats and reflecting, of course, upon the miraculous presence of the historic body of Christ in the monstrance that was passing before them. So the fear of Jewish proximity to the Eucharist in the Corpus Christi processions actually intensified from the 12th to the 15th century, mainly due to the proliferation of host desecration allegations, the belief that Jews would steal a consecrated wafer and actually try and destroy it. But now with these processions, the sight of Jews with their hats securely and defiantly upon their heads frustrated the Christian sense of exclusive participation in the procession. It confirmed and contributed to the sense of anti-structure, a failure for Christianity to safeguard what was sacred, and reminding Christians that occupants of their public space actually included followers of a different religion who might contaminate the event. And this meant that when the Modernese Inquisition promulgated its edict contra gli abusi del conversare de cristiani con ebrei, which means against the abuses of Christians talking with Jews in 1603, it demanded that no Jew should be present when religious processions passed through the duchy. They are not to meet in processions of Christians, and particularly when the Holy Sacrament is being brought. By 1667, the Inquisition in Ferrara, under Inquisitor General Giacinto Maria Granaria de Genova, had issued more specific directions how Jews were to avoid encountering a Christian procession. The edict ordered Jews found in a place where a procession passes or a confraternity with crosses or holy images have to immediately retreat, not just turning away, but absenting themselves completely. And most of the cases that I found were initiated with delations by Christians, sometimes priests, who were irritated by the Jews' presence and their seeming contempt for processions and their participants. And the Jews' close proximity to processions also meant that accidents often happened. For example, when Alessandro Formigini was accused of failing to show reverence to the Holy Sacrament while he was walking through the streets of Terra Finale in Modena, he argued that he had been standing on the embankment of the Ponte Nuovo, the New Bridge, and thus could not hide in time from the chaplain carrying the Eucharist to the sick, who was basically walking towards him on the same bridge. Nor could he argued, enter one of the courtyards or houses in the vicinity because he did not know to which house the Eucharist was being taken. The assumption was that the Eucharist was being taken to somebody who was sick in their home, who couldn't come to church, and therefore the procession was to ensure that it was taken properly as a sacrament to the home of the person who needed it. On All Saints' Day in 1665, at a Christian funeral conducted by 7 friars in Modena, Simone Levi and Samuele de Sanguinetti were caught with their hats on their heads in the presence of the Holy Cross. Both Jews argued that they had been inebriated, they drunk too much. They had drunk some good wine, in fact, and they apologized profusely to the inquisitors. And what appeared to particularly annoy the Christian delators and witnesses was that Jews refused to doff their hats towards the image. Why can't they just take off their hats? And in Terra Finale in 1657, when Moisen Israel Meli was brought to the Inquisition for failing to absent himself from a procession carrying the Holy Sacrament, he stated that the Jews' failure to remove their hats was in fact done out of duty to Jewish law. If I was contemptuous, he says, in not taking off my hat on this occasion, it is because for us Jews, it is prohibited to remove our hats on such occasions. Inquisitor General Giacomo Tinti of Modena had his notary draw a map of the intersection in Terre Finali where Emanuele Castelfranco had stood without removing his hat at a funeral procession in 1645 when sacred Christian images were carried past him. The Jew, in turn, used the map in order to testify exactly where he had stood, and in this case, his reluctance to leave reflected actually his desire to show respect at the funeral of his Christian friend, and so Emmanuel tells the inquisitor, Reverend Father, yes, I knew the late Monsieur Domenico Ferrara. He was a great friend whom I knew in Finale. And of course, although hints at friendship between Jews and Christians are rare in the cases that deal with the Jews' presence at processions, one can find glimpses of tolerance and understanding on the part of Christian witnesses towards the unlucky Jew caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. In 1627, the priest Johannes Tommaso of de Gebetoni showed compassion towards the predicament of Jews in these cases. He argued, I believe that the most holy sacrament appears suddenly before the Jews, and therefore they were not able to retire in time. This action should not be attributed to malice, but more to an oversight. And beside a reprimand, the Jew was released without punishment. In these cases, the Inquisition reproved and punished the Jew for disrespect for the Christian church, rather than for more serious acts of sacrilege or blasphemy. And if we look at the Jews' evidence in these cases, we see that they expressed their absolute respect for and sensitivity to the Christian icons and sacred objects that surrounded them and those that were carried in processions, or at least they tried to do so. Most understood that the ringing of the bell preceded the procession, gave them time to get away before the procession proceeded, and their best move was to retreat before it approached. What they did not admit was that they had a defiant verse that they commonly uttered to protect themselves when they encountered such images. And this is really carrying on from our previous week when we were already finding that there was a curse that Jews would say under their breath when they came upon a Christian image. And this was actually revealed to me by the neophyte Giacomo Grisoffi, who in 1605 was brought in a different trial. This is against Donato Donati, who is accused of dissuading others from baptism. And Giacomo testifies to the imprecation Jews uttered when Christians bowed down to a holy image during the Ave Maria. So remember, this is a Jew who has become a Christian, and at this point he's willing to tell the inquisitor what Jews say when they come upon a Christian image. When they hear us singing the Ave Maria and the Christians kneel on the ground, they, the Jews, say the words of the verse of David, Ipsi obligati sunt et sesiderunt nas autem surreximus et erecti sumus, which, as the Jews understand it, means that those who kneel, the Christians, are small, unlike these others, the Jews, who stand on foot and are being raised in the grace of God. Their words are these. Now look how interesting it is that this is transliterated, the Hebrew letters here to make the inquisitor understand it. And here you can see this actual, what it means, the translation of this, they kneel and fall, but we rise and gain strength. So this is what Jews uttered when they saw a Christian image. They kneel, the Christians kneel and fall, but we stand high and we gain strength. We will not be intimidated by the Christians. By standing tall, failing to genuflect, Giacomo Grissoffi argued the Jews believed themselves to remain closer to God than those Christians who had bowed down to worship him through the image. And now finally, we will discuss how Jews fared with images inside and outside their homes according to the inquisitorial trials. These sacred images were frescoes or panel paintings incorporated into the woodwork, such as built-in devotional tabernacles, cupboards, wainscoting or doors, sometimes many centuries old. And as we know, whereas in early centuries Jews had struggled to acquire licenses to whitewash the domestic images, as we saw with Daniel de Norsa, by the 17th century, Jews standing before the Holy Office showed that they had found that more temporary coverings were less likely to incur perilous charges of desecration. And with this, I would say, continuous anxiety that Jews had to deal with regarding images in their property, it is not surprising that the Jews should, whenever possible, avoid renting premises that contained Christian images in any form. In 1627, for example, Simone Camerino and his son-in-law Zaccaria Sassano, Jews of Modena, were investigated for wanting to rent a property that had depicted on its outside wall a large figure of the Blessed Virgin facing the street. And it was revealed that Jews had in fact wanted to remove not the image itself, but the torch above it, since it provided illumination for members of a Christian confraternity who venerated the image by singing a litany before it every Saturday night. The Jews' proposal to rent this apartment had clearly alarmed the Christian group. And Zaccaria testified before Fra Domenico Greco, "Your lordship," and obviously you always show respect to the inquisitor, "Signore," or "your lord," should be assured that I absolutely did not say that the figure should be removed, but I only spoke about the danger of the lamp. I did not want to go and live in that house because of the danger. It would be much worse now to go and live there because those Christians are praying outside the house. They seem to be doing this to show their contempt of us. Because of this, Zaccaria testified, the Jew had decided not to rent the property. And it seems that by the middle of the 17th century, certain cities, such as Reggio, had begun to authorize rulings that Jews could not live in properties that housed images of the Virgin. And if we think about the Jews' domestic spaces in early modern Italy, we should note that Jews often ran their pawnbroking activities inside these spaces. And here you see the most famous pawnbroking house in the Venetian ghetto that still, you can see it today. It's called the Banco Rosso, the Red Bank. And from around 1600, there were 400 to 500 Jewish banks in northern and central Italy, but their number declined in some parts during the 17th century as Jews turned more to international trade in the ports of Ancona, in Genoa, and Livorno. Another case that I found interesting was what happened in Modena regarding a bank that was under the management of Elia Tessio, his son Salvatore Tessio, and Viviano Modena. This was one of the three remaining Jewish banks that made small loans to Modenese Christians in the 17th century. In 1665, this bank faced the most severe interrogation for holding pawns, 10 crucifixes, as well as a ducatone, a large sort of ducat coin, and a medallion with a portrait of Pope Innocent X. Elia Tessio, Salvatore Tessio, and Viviano Modena argued that they had believed that there was a distinction between sacred items found in churches, which therefore had direct contact with the Eucharistic wafer and wine, and devotionalia, which were obviously personal belongings. And they maintained that few of their crucifixes were worth a great deal, but they were going to get into trouble because these were Christian sacred objects. And Vivianus Modena says in his testimony, when we take pledges in gold and silver, we weigh them, but we do not give all the money for the value of the said gold and silver according to its weight. We give only what conforms to the value of the object to remain as a security in the bank. So, the Jewish banker argued, they were responding to Christian demand rather than plotting sacrilege. All of the three main bankers of this Spagnoli Bank, as it was called, were interrogated, then imprisoned overnight, ensuring that they would not be able to collaborate or discuss their interrogations, and were released with a warning the following day. Each of the 10 crucifixes were opened by the Inquisition, and they were actually found to be reliquaries, holders of holy relics inside. A notary now speculated that the Jews might have forced the reliquaries open and scooped out some sort of holy wax that was inside the reliquary, and some of them were empty, or some of them had their relic removed. Each of the Jewish bankers denied that they had ever known about the crosses being reliquaries. And the suspects obviously know that the wisest thing for them to do is to apologize, place themselves at the mercy of the Inquisition, and accept whatever decision the Inquisition makes. But the shocking realization that the Spagnoli Bank had been holding crosses that were in fact reliquaries made the Inquisitor General begin a sequestration of Christian sacred objects held by the other Jewish banks in Modena and even further afield in the Duchy. And this trial is actually recorded on 198 folios, a long investigation lasting from December 1664 to November 1665. One banker, Rafael Levi de Rovigo, chooses to forestall his own arrest by coming to the Inquisition and handing over 8 crosses he was keeping in his bank. He testifies, I have presented myself here in this holy office because of a case against Eliatesio and companions who have a bank in this city regarding a silver pendant cross that they sold by auction. I am a banker in another bank, and I've come to admit some error. I've come to make it clear that in my bank too there were some small crosses of silver worn around the neck which have been pledged as pawns by virtue of the privileges which we have in our charters, because they're allowed to be moneylenders. And if we did not have these privileges, we would not have taken them. But if we have known that in regard to the Holy Office this was an error, we would not have accepted them. And although these Jews suffered the humiliation and anxiety of being arrested and interrogated, they were released on bail and not punished. But they were given a grave warning and forbidden, on pain of a heavy fine, to accept any type of cross or any type of object pertaining to the Christian religion. Why had the Inquisition gone to such lengths to remove these trinkets or ornaments from Jewish premises? Well, it seems that it wanted to be meticulously careful that no such object should be in the Jews' possession. So thinking about everything we've discussed in our 4 sessions together, we have seen that the actual Jew who comes to court differs from the fictive Jew of the Middle Ages. The real Jew did not test or experiment with images, but fully realized that Christians suspected him of damaging them, and hence his need to protect himself when he found to his embarrassment that he did actually have them on his premises. And to some extent, the real Jew was the one who accidentally got himself into difficulties, tried to explain to Christian authorities, someone who accidentally maybe came upon a religious procession or had taken the wrong kind of pawn. The Roman Inquisition, as we see, remained skeptical about the allegations of malicious image desecration, but showed an interest, of course, in investigating the Christian accusations and using them as an opportunity to monitor, to judge, and to discipline the Jews when expedient. But the majority of accusations against the Jews of northern Italy were, as I said before, unproven. Jews did not usually engage in image desecration or readily risk removing Christian images from their immediate environment, whatever their Christian accusers might say to the contrary. The 71 cases demonstrate a range of Jewish behavior towards Christian images that were in turn self-protective, principled, respectful, pragmatic, legally circumscribed, professional, and regulated. I think a clear sign for us that it was better to desecrate a Christian image through words under one's breath than through physical violence. So now, let me make some general conclusions to our series on Jews and Christian art. I hope I've convinced you of the long history of the allegation that Jews made a practice of desecrating religious images revered by Christians from the 5th to the 17th century of the Christian era. How Christians connected Jews and Christian images depended, of course, on the extent of image saturation in society, the political, social, and economic position of the Jews, and the level of antagonism against them. As we saw in our first lecture, tales and legends instilled common ideas and beliefs in the minds of large numbers of people. In our second lecture, we saw how the legend and tales moved across Europe, where their listeners shaped and shared knowledge, especially when Christian images began to define who fitted in Christian society and who did not. Here, these Marian tales were newly adapted in light of the increasing isolation and violence that the Jews faced in England and northern France, reflecting the Christian anxiety towards them. In our third lecture, we studied Jewish sources and how Jews showed themselves responding to Christian images. To assume that the Jews were silent to these allegations, of course, would be wrong. As images proliferated and became ubiquitous, the rabbis increasingly adapted tactics to avoid looking at them and to minimize contact with them. In their own prescriptive sources, Jews were warned that they could expect to be framed by unscrupulous Christians who were determined to discredit them and who contrived to accuse them of treating Christian images with gross disrespect. Today, we have looked at Italy. In many ways, the accusations against Jews in Italy were an amalgamation of tales, except that now Jews are no longer seen as agents who could really make images bleed. It's interesting because in Italy you often see Christians being accused of making Jews bleed, or Anabaptists or Protestants, but not so much Jews. Jews have now been removed from that fantastical allegation. As Christian images became ubiquitous in both public and private spaces, accusations against Jews now involved images on walls, in transit, in homes, in pawnbrokers' banks, and around people's necks. And this was clearly one of the many hazards of living as a minority in a Catholic country. Jews led their lives trying to defend themselves against these types of accusations as yet another form of discrimination that they had to cope with. And I hope you will agree with me that what we have identified is a recurring pattern of anti-Judaism. Christianity attributed to Jews a mentality involving idolatry, materialism, legalism, and literal-mindedness, which acted as a foil for everything that true, spiritually minded Christians were supposed to believe in. Yet assertions and ways of thinking die hard, and the belief that Jews were inclined to damage images persisted well after the close of the 17th century. For example, in Pisa in 1787, crowds attempted to lynch 3 Jews who were falsely accused of spitting on sacred images in the cathedral. Unusually in this case, 2 Muslims were also involved. A North African Jew was killed after the forces of law and order failed to protect him. It remains for me to surmise, perhaps as a last thought, that this long-standing allegation contributes significantly to the creation of the modern anti-Semitic perception of Jews in some art historical surveys as lacking their own identity and cultural and artistic ability, and continually preying upon the art of their host nation. This perception, which was reiterated in 1849 by Richard Wagner in Das Kunstwerk des Zukunft, the artwork of the future, would last until the 1980s, when finally Jewish art began to be regarded as a subject worthy of its own study at Israeli universities. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Thank you to Tamar, to Chagai, and to Rivka, and for all the team here at Beit Avichai.